Okay. And sort of beyond the kind of putting a button on just the sort of use of dynamic aggregate supply aggregate demand, there is sort of one kind of final bit of conversation we need to have to highlight. We want to make sure that we're really discussing the really influential ideas, why they were influential, and ultimately, how those have fit into the narrative that economists have in terms of kind of what we would call mainstream macroeconomics. Yeah, I've talked a little bit about this. There's been some subtext to this all term. Mainstream macro is in a place now where there's just a lot of agreement on the sort of fundamentals, and then an extreme amount of disagreement on a lot of what I think, someone from my perspective who wouldn't necessarily call myself a macroeconomist, but as an economist who is very interested, of course, in macroeconomics, but ultimately is more of a microeconomist. Um, to me, it seems like macro has come to a place where you can kind of discuss the general thrust of theory in the context of what we might refer to as stylized facts. Stylized facts is a term I like to use that sort of describes empirical truths that we have found out over time. I think oftentimes people, especially those folks who maybe haven't been trained as economists or even just economics majors in recent years, they don't necessarily realize how empirical everything's become in economics, and therefore, really economists are sort of trying at all times to figure out what ideas they can ignore in many ways. Now, sometimes, we do that maybe at such a pace that we get it wrong, and we may do that maybe at our own peril at times. But we want to, come up with ideas, see how they look empirically, what works we take with us, and what doesn't. We at least, put, maybe we keep them in the back of our heads, but we sort of, it's what we use in arguments. When I sort of talk with people about economic policy, you know, I really try to make sure that I engage people on, the facts of economic systems, especially, of course, the United States economy, and to frame the entire conversation not really so much philosophically. I think that from my perspective, as soon as you kind of get into the relative philosophies that surround macroeconomics, um, even amongst economists, you start to get into a little bit of trouble. So if you just keep it at the kind of fundamental level, then I think that you can really kind of look at it from this science perspective. And then when you look at sort of the innovations and the ideas, and really the quality of macroeconomic policy post 1970s, and not just in the US, but in many parts of the world. One of the sort of interesting sort of undercurrents of the sort of success, shall we say, of like specifically monetary policy in the United States, is that it also precipitated an interesting sort of spread of ideas by way of developing countries would very often bring in big name economists from the United States to help them manage their own economic systems, to make the decisions that we've been talking about, fiscal stimulus, monetary contraction, negative supply shocks, positive demand shocks, whatever's going on. How do you design tax systems? So one of the economists that I studied under at the University of Tennessee, Bill Fox, he would in fact be go to countries and help them design their tax codes to make their tax codes more efficient and more economic friendly, and so ideas that were formed in economic theory and then tested empirically and produced these sort of stylized facts. They did not just affect the U.S. economy. They spread, all across the world. And then, of course, there's all sorts of contributions from schools of economics outside of United States ones. And I don't know, I feel like for a long time in the early 2000s, like when I was in grad school, the joke was that, macro was all over the place because, you know, prior to the Great Recession, macro was really stuck in this sort of very like loud debate about kind of classical versus Keynesian versus real business cycle ideas. And real business cycle ideas had kind of come to dominate macro in many ways because once there was sort of this prolonged stretch of economic prosperity, I think that in a way it gave economists fewer crises to be looking at, and then therefore they were sort of left to kind of come up with in a way more interesting stories than perhaps were actually there. I'm probably being a bit unfair to the real business cycle folks, but there was a really strong sense that real business cycle folks, which we're going to talk a little bit in a moment about what that means. They had come to dominate macro merely because the math was complicated. And this really struck at the heart of really, and I've said this a little bit in some videos, the sort of sense that economics had become too mathematical and then therefore had become out of touch with the general population. And I think that argument carried over into macro. And then again, it was interesting towards the end. I finished my PhD in 2013, and there had been this real Keynesian revolution, man. It was like, you were sort of like, why are we teaching kids ISLM to, I get to teach ISLM and show all these, things. So I like the fact that we've sort of come to a place where we can kind of start the conversation, where it goes. And there's certainly a lot of debates here or there, how much fiscal stimulus should there be? How much monetary tightening, should there be? How forgiving should unemployment insurance schemes be? How much should the government cover healthcare? All, insurance markets and financial services markets and things like that, energy markets. I mean, there's a lot of stuff, obviously, that goes on within those particular contexts. And a lot of disagreement, even amongst economists. But is there an aggregate supply in the economy? Is there an aggregate demand in the economy? Do we generally know why and how inflation works? Do we generally know why and how output increases? Whatever. Yeah, that stuff we have a good handle on, and it's sort of this play between complexity and simplicity. And it's always about kind of, that's where the art of economics gets in there. Okay, so now to that perspective, or to that end, let's kind of just fill in some gaps here in terms of wrapping up this section of what I would kind of call post-Keynesian stuff, and focus on two particular strands of economic ideas. The first that we'll focus on is springs forth from this sort of Taylor rule conversation we've been having, and the focus on the way in which the central bank manages ultimately inflation and also inflation expectations. And then we'll talk a little bit about RBC and sort of leave that conversation for more advanced macro classes where you're going to cover more of that, but just kind of set it up and have a little bit of conversation about what it really means, real business cycle. Okay, so let's take a change in monetary policy to the dynamic framework. In particular, we're going to put the inflation target from 2 to 1%. So we're targeting a lower level of inflation, right? So this is contractionary monetary policy. And so we know what it's going to shift, and we know how it's going to shift. It's going to shift aggregate demand back. And in particular is going to constitute lower output and lower inflation. And then we'll see how this looks on the graph in just a second. Okay, so we have the initial shift of aggregate demand back here. Notice here that we start with aggregate supply T minus 1 and T. So T is when the monetary policy kicks in. Monetary policy kicks in at T, target a lower inflation, therefore targeting higher interest rates, contractionary monetary policy. And so what you get is you get lower inflation, and therefore that starts to kick into lower inflation expectations. And then in addition to that, you also now get a negative output gap, and that's also going to put downward pressure on inflation. And so, we get this sort of uncomfortable sort of rule, or in a sense, is that, if you have inflation or persistent inflation, and you want to fight it with monetary policy, it is, more than likely going to create more unemployment than you would have otherwise, right? Because you're pushing yourself at the very least below the current level of output. And in this case, if the economy is at sort of potential output, you're going to be pushing it below that. You get nice downward pressure on inflation, but it certainly comes at a cost of short run economic dysfunction. And so again, this is sort of that natural trade off. So okay, here we go, right? We get inflation targeted lower. We're going to target it for the rest of the time. Output declines, rises, but never gets back. So permanently lower output. Again, we have, permanently lower inflation, permanently higher real interest rates, and permanently lower nominal interest rates. Again, back to that Taylor rule component. So let's think about this for a second. Why does all this occur, right? So again, just the two basic steps here. We get a lower inflation target, shifts the aggregate demand curve back. This gives us lower output, and then therefore lower inflation. Expected inflation now declines because inflation is lower due to the backward shift. The aggregate supply shifts backwards now, and this, it causes an uptick in output and lower inflation. So in a sense, this is kind of the sort of Goldilocks situation, right? We've increased economic growth from YT to greater than YT, and we've done so through less inflation, or even to some extent, you might consider this to be deflation. Although you'll notice that if we have a really high inflation rate, we might just be slowing inflation down. In fact, that's typically what we're doing. People were right, to point out back in 2023, yeah, inflation was declining. That didn't mean prices were declining. That just meant the rate at which they were increasing was declining. So now the reason why we bring all this conversation up is because now we start to have to think a little bit more complex about the shapes of these curves, the magnitudes of the shifts, right? I mean, think back to ISLM analysis. And one of the important conversations was the elasticity of ISLM, and how that then sort of played into the conversation of preferred policy. So let's jump into that a little bit here. So the parameters of the monetary policy thus far, in particular, the thetas, theta pi, which is the parameter that basically gives the inflation target. I'm sorry, excuse me, the nominal interest rate target, its movement from the inflation gap being current, actual inflation, pi t, minus pi t star. Pi t star, again, is our inflation target. And then we get theta y, which is the output gap parameter, the extent to which the output gap causes changes in the nominal interest rate. This is certainly, I think, ultimately the most complex part of the dynamic ASAD, because you get this kind of circular logic kind of thing going on, because there are all these moving parts. Like, for example, in this particular setup, we're saying that the inflation target is lower, right? So in the context of just the basic idea of this model, the idea would be that this pi t has declined. And then so when we take this idea into the next time period, what ends up happening sort of in an interesting way is that if pi t star declines and then pi t also declines, then you get subsequently the same change in nominal interest rate as predicated by the inflation gap that you had prior, but you're doing it at a lower level of inflation. Right. So that's kind of one of the interesting ideas, is like, once you first get past that initial contractionary monetary policy, once you get to that lower inflationary target, Now, once inflation, an expectation settles inflation at that level, you end up getting the same inflation gap. So then ultimately you get the same consequence in terms of the Taylor rule for the nominal interest rate targeting that you got previously. You just get it at lower interest rates. So one important point here is it doesn't change relative to kind of where you are in terms of inflation. It's always relative to the gap. So it's always relative to where you start in a way. And that's just, that's kind of important to point out. And then this output gap, right? So why, what are the important part of thetas? Thetas are, in a sense, part of monetary policy, right? That's the idea here, is ultimately that the central bank it ultimately not only affects or controls, in a sense, the inflation target, or sets the inflation target, but ultimately those parameters are in some sense in their policy tool bag. Okay, so let's talk about that for a moment. So if we think about the sort of derivation of the aggregate demand curve in the context of those particular parameters. So in other words, we take the classic aggregate demand curve that we've already worked through, and we see that A is equal to basically the relative sort of extensitivity of the Taylor rule to inflation gap, and then you'll notice relative to the sensitivity of the Taylor rule for the output gap affect, again, this sort of inflationary gap component. And then the B part is the extent to which the shock affects any sort of exogenous shock affects aggregate demand. And so the idea here is that the central bank, both in the context of the sort of Taylor rule consideration, but just in general, affects theta y and theta pi to influence the slope ultimately of aggregate demand. So now we get into monetary policy not merely being able to shift aggregate demand, but also to affect, rather, that's kind of a funny way of putting it, maybe a bit of a Freudian slip there, affect the slope of the aggregate demand. So again, the setup here, the kind of classic sort of thought experiment, the initial idea that Taylor had was, imagine a negative supply shock. Again, we're thinking 1970s. We're thinking, what affected the U.S. economy? That's how all of this got developed. So we have a negative supply shock. Central bank now faces, as it says here, two bads. You can reduce inflation. That's going to cause you have to further reduce output. Or you can try to boost output. That's going to cause inflation. And so we get back to this idea of monetary policy as being this sort of trade-off. If you think back to the notion of the sacrifice ratio that we've talked about before, right? The extent of economic growth in real GDP that we must give up to fight inflation. Because again, the idea here is that if you just want to grow your economy, just pump it full of fiscal stimulus, run zero interest rate policy, and the economy is going to grow, 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 and grow. And then at a certain point, though, economic theory at least would predict, you're going to get completely runaway inflation. You're going to get that classic hyper inflation. We don't talk a lot about hyperinflation often in intermediate macro. It's very often an idea you set up in principles of macro, because frankly, if you look, for example, if the crux of an intermediate macro class is largely about the conversations about the U.S. economy in particular, because that's where all these ideas were developed, were in U.S. universities for the most part. I don't mean to take away much from other folks, but that's the case, and that might be biased, right? That might bias the ideas. By the way, that's an interesting conversation for us to have, regardless. Hyperinflation was this huge concern. And I think the hyperinflation concern, it would be easy for us to look at it and say, yeah, well, it's we haven't had it, so we shouldn't be worried about it anymore. Listen, if we're going to worry about the Great Depression happening again, it was an event nobody saw coming, didn't expect it, was exacerbated by bad policy, the exact same thing that had happened in the case of hyperinflation, when and where it's happened. So, in Germany, post World War I, hyperinflation, we know why it happened. We sort of know what made it worse. Zimbabwe is obviously a very classic example of hyperinflation. And beyond the sort of concept of hyperinflation, inflation that goes above 100%, perhaps sometimes month over month. There's also sort of parts of the world that have been sort of especially inflationary. For example, the country of Turkey recently has been running extremely high inflation rates year over year, something like 30, 40%, which frankly, as an American, feels like hyperinflation. So I don't think there's any reason to sort of um, put down the concern, even though because we haven't had it, right? It's sort of like telling people not to be worried about a hurricane because there haven't been hasn't been one in a long time. You should worry about it a little bit. Okay, so again, the beauty of all this, the beauty of economics is that if something affects the slope of it and you want to see what that then means, draw the curves with different slopes. So you can see here we have very flat aggregate supply, aggregate demand curve, and then we have relatively flat again, or same flatness of aggregate supply with a much steeper aggregate demand. Now, the sort of immediate consequence of a steeper aggregate demand is that any negative aggregate supply shock is going to be even more inflationary. However, it's going to give up less output. Right. So if you look at that graph to the right over here, if we get a subsequent aggregate supply shift back, so if inflation expectations kick in, or if we happen to be beyond output, so we have a positive output gap, aggregate supply is going to shift back in that case. And then, if aggregate demand is very steep, then we're going to get a lot of inflation, but not so much of a hit on output, right? Or on the other hand, if aggregate demand is very flat, then we can get a very large aggregate supply shift back and get not much inflation, but much larger effect on output. This is the sort of delicateness of monetary policy once you get just beyond general inflation rate, unemployment rate targeting, nominal interest rate targeting, whatever is now this is really the trade-off. And this is big stuff, right? I mean, not just in the U.S., but you go other parts of the world. We're talking about bad monetary policy has the potential to be ruinous to countries. We've been very lucky in the U.S. that we had bad monetary policy for at least a couple of decades, and certainly had bad monetary policy back during the Great Depression. But we learned from our mistakes. It seems like. Now, some people sort of like to buy into the idea that this has all been sort of illusory. But I think even someone like Taylor, who is very skeptical, by the way, ultimately of our ability to get this all right. I mean, I think the idea that Taylor's coming up with here is that, like, look, I don't think you can do this, but if you could do it, this is how you should do it, or this is how you could do it, essentially. So the Taylor principle says that basically any increase in inflation should be met with an even larger percentage increase in nominal interest rate target. So basically, not only should you basically bake into a rule that any inflation is met with an increase in nominal interest rate targeting, but he also argues that the increase in nominal interest rate targeting should be larger than the increase in percentage terms in terms of inflation. And the concern there, and this is, I think, one of the more abstract but ultimately interesting ideas in economics, is that he argues that this causes the aggregate demand curve to then slope upward. So, because what happens is that if you are only going to fight inflation with an equal or less than increase in the nominal interest rate target, then the subsequent shift in magnitude that you are inducing to fight that inflation will, in a sense, be naturally smaller than the inflationary event. And because remember, the inflationary event, basically, if the inflation gap stays positive. So in other words, you could fight inflation, but you undershoot it for some reason. So you still get higher inflation than your target. Then what that's going to cause is inflation expectations are going to continue to rise. What's really problematic about that, by the way, is that let's say you successfully crimp the economy, you push output back, but you don't push it back in a sense enough to fully get rid of the inflation, but you've hurt output. So now you've hurt the economy, and then you still have more inflation than you want. And then so if again, because the rule is actual inflation relative to the target. And so if you're expecting that gap, you're expecting the inflation gap to go to zero after policy, but let's say after policy it doesn't go to zero such there still is this inflation, then you're going to have to respond with even more, or you're going to have to accept higher inflation. This is that the delicateness of monetary policy, right? This is why now monetary policy is done out in the open, because in a sense, all of those ideas, rational expectations, the context of forward-looking markets, and all of this means that monetary policy has to be especially sensitive to the extent to which they are able to achieve their inflation target, which means that, of course, they have to be especially sensitive to the extent to which they can achieve their nominal interest rate target. But the interesting thing about that is one of the main reasons why we've moved from a money supply target, or really even an inflation target, we've moved to an interest rate targeting world, is because, in a stable economic system such as the US, and I think especially aided by the fact that we're the world's reserve currency, our central bank basically knows that they can affect interest rates. The inflation part is in a sense harder, but they know that part. And so this is, I think Taylor ultimately says, hey, inflation's hard to manage. We know how to manage interest rates really well. And so therefore, let's fight inflation with what we know we can fight inflation with best, which is nominal interest rate targeting. And then, Taylor sort of the ultimate argument there becomes kind of this rules versus discretion sort of idea. And Taylor rule obviously implies that Taylor was in support of a rule. Again, we have not chosen a rule in the U.S., but there's been a sort of an interesting sort of sense that the central bank clearly in the U.S. is very aware of the time consistency need. That is to say that if you're going to have sort of rules-based or near rules-based monetary policy, you need to tell people how you see things. It's not so much that you need to tell people what your rules are, because you've already told them what your rules are. You've sort of signaled what your rules are, right? This is inflation we're targeting. These are the interest rates we're targeting. But rather, what you want to make sure, or what you want to take advantage of in that sort of expectations-driven world, is that you're telling people this is where things are as we see it. We already told you where we want them to be. Therefore, you know what we're going to do the next time data comes out and things have changed or have not changed. So it is a complete telegraphing of monetary policy. And the whole idea of it is basically, I think, and I think this is part of sort of the internal debate, is also to sort of serve as warning on the fiscal policy side, which is basically like, look, we're no longer going to be accommodating of bad fiscal policy. I would say that's the biggest thing that came out of sort of the Taylor rule and Taylor principles, is that we're not going to accommodate bad fiscal policy anymore. If there's bad fiscal policy, we're going to fight inflation, because that is our job as the Federal Reserve. And we believe in this sort of historical stylized fact that we're going to sort of worry a little bit more about inflation than we are going to worry about unemployment, in the part that, because in the US, we can sort of manage unemployment a little bit more directly, whereas inflation ends up being, a little bit more of a three-point shot at times. It doesn't mean we don't make them. It just means that we make fewer of them, maybe, than what we want to. And so again, we go back to this sort of in the place where the theta, the relationship between inflation. So there are two particular cases where theta pi is greater than zero. So if inflation rises, the central bank increases higher nominal interest rate targeting even more, then the real interest rate rises, and then for the reduction in demand for goods and services is such that we get a decline in inflation. So this goes back to kind of this idea of the magnitudes of the shift. It's very hard to affect the magnitudes in some sense, especially on the aggregate supply side. Aggregate demand, you can sort of get a little bit better of a measurement there, but the shift in aggregate supply is much harder. So we can sort of the way that we sort of affect the positionality of output and inflation again ends up being about the sort of aggregate demand. The irony of this that I like to point out whenever I teach the Taylor idea and Taylor principle is that, I think Taylor was kind of sort of naturally an anti-Keynesian, or at least a post-Keynesian, very much against this sort of idea of demand management. And then ultimately the Taylor rule ends up being about affecting the slope of aggregate demand, basically to keep aggregate demand downward sloping, which, I don't know, certainly sounds like demand management to me. So if theta pi is less than zero, then inflation rises. The central bank targets the higher nominal interest rate. The real interest rate declines, so you get an increase in demand. Therefore, inflation it goes up. So the concern, of course, with the upward slope in aggregate demand is that you basically no longer get to fight inflation with higher nominal interest rate targeting, because basically inflation is larger than the increase in nominal interest rate, so your real interest rate declines. And the concern, of course, is that an upward sloping aggregate demand curve, when does it potentially form? We might generally think that a downward sloping aggregate demand curve is the norm, but maybe again going back to how we thought about in terms of like a liquidity trap, or ways to think about ISLM, when is that typically going to occur? And so again, we can think about sort of an upward sloping aggregate demand curve arising during sort of scenarios in which the economy is especially sensitive to inflation. So we can think about the elasticity of output to inflation here. And so we can imagine that there are times when the central bank wants to make the economy more sensitive to inflation, or wants to make the economy less sensitive to inflation. And this has to do with where we are in terms of our inflationary story. So if we had a lot of inflation recently, then in a sense, what we want to do is we want to make the economy less sensitive to inflation, to the extent that we don't have to bring inflation down very much to get a fairly big hit in output. So we want to flatten the aggregate demand curve. Or if for example, we want things to be more sensitive to inflation, because maybe we're just kind of trying to fight. We want to fight inflation, and we want to put the economy in a place where we can do so without having to take much, if all, of a hit on output. In that case, we want the aggregate demand curve to be very steep. And I think Taylor would argue that we generally, because it's a sort of inflationary fighting perspective, so we generally would tend to prefer to keep the aggregate demand curve fairly steep, because if it's fairly steep, then you can get this sort of place where it's easier to fight inflation with a relative contractionary policy in terms of kind of focusing on that aggregate, that output perspective, right? You can sort of move things up or down from that expected inflation perspective. And so, but then the idea becomes, well, what happens if not only is the aggregate demand curve upward sloping, as we might expect during times of economic dysfunction, but then steeper than the aggregate supply curve? Then the big thing here is that the idea is the economy is completely unstable. The concern here is that the economy is in a state where we no longer expect there to be any sort of stable equilibria. Right. So again, under normal circumstances, when the economy is functioning normally, we actually expect there to be this sort of equilibrium setting, and therefore kind of stable inflation. But then the sort of relative kind of sensitivity that the economy has to the interplay between inflation and output then leads to this potentially perverse position that we find ourselves in the economy, where we have to fight it because we have this sort of sense that inflation is the biggest concern. But in fighting it, it's going to require us to take such a hit on output, right? Again, just think in terms of an upward sloping aggregate demand curve, right? And you tried to sort of fight it now with contractionary monetary policy. and you're shifting a now upward sloping aggregate demand curve back, right? Think about kind of, again, contractionary monetary policy becomes inflationary in that world, right? Because you're shifting an upward sloping curve back. So an upward sloping curve being shifted back, right? It leads to more inflation. And so that's the in a sense the scary potential, and again the idea that the instability leads to this runaway inflation. During the COVID pandemic, there was this sense that we might get to this point. And the concern there was that we might get to this point also in part because of those negative supply shocks, right? We had this sort of disruption in global supply chains. That's essentially a negative supply shock. So then when we really start pushing aggregate demand out via fiscal expansion, the concern is that we may cause so much inflation that then the aggregate demand curve ends up swinging upwards, and then monetary policy would sort of not be able to find a place. And then what you would, in that world, you think about that world, the only thing that you can sort of hope for is that you get a positive aggregate supply shift, or you have to sort of think about trying to recalibrate the economy through those thetas to get it back to being sort of normal and stable. So that's when we talk about the stability of monetary policy, it's sort of in part to ensure that the aggregate demand curve stays downward sloping. The behavior of that and the way in which it can not become that way is in part because of our strong belief in things like expectations. And then, so just to kind of put the final cap on this, the way we sort of think about monetary policy is there used to be this sort of rules-based way of thinking called lean against the wind. It's we still, I think we use this idea, even though it's not really a set in stone rule. The idea of like leaning against the wind is that there are sort of two main things that we're thinking about. There is this unemployment gap, and there is this output gap. Now, the reason why we tend to focus on unemployment and output gap is because we can sort of ignore, in a sense, the sort of behavior of aggregate demand because we know what it's doing. And so therefore that the output gap ends up being really a story about where we are aggregate demand and natural output, potential output, with aggregate supply in a sense just sort of trailing. It's a very Keynesian idea, actually. So you sort of lean against the wind, which means is that if you perceive a positive output gap, you sort of start incrementally fighting inflation. If you experience a positive unemployment gap, it isn't the case that you start fighting deflation. What that actually does, and this is the important part of leaning against the wind, is relative to the other issues potentially in your economic system, if you have a non-inflationary sort of situation, in other words, you're in sort of a contraction, but not necessarily a recession. So in other words, your economy has no inflationary pressure, and maybe that's because you're sort of at a place where there's no, we're sort of at natural unemployment. We're not above or below it, but sort of no pressure in either direction. Then what that sort of enables us to do is then solve sort of these other issues potentially, because we're sort of in close to that flat portion of aggregate supply, but not in the part where we're kind of fighting an inflation. And so, I'm sorry, excuse me, fighting a recession, where we know we're in a flat portion of aggregate supply. And so this sort of rules versus discretion thing and the sort of focus ends up being on this kind of time consistency as well as lean against the wind. So the Fed signals policy. Why does the Fed signal policy? Because they need to keep aggregate demand downward sloping. That's why the time consistency becomes such a big issue. And so one of the main ways that we keep inflation expectations down is the Fed sends a signal, hey, we are focused on fighting inflation. It isn't even so much whatever inflation happens to be. It's just that we're going to fight it. So that was sort of, I think, the big part of the stability of the kind of mid 90s through all the way up until really the COVID sort of era when things got destabilized. There was such a stability of inflation and then also a stability of monetary policy. Even though there was quite a bit of movement, it was just always at the margin. And because we had gotten to a point where the central bank's ability to keep the aggregate demand curve downward sloping the way we want it to be had become high quality enough that when they were able to then carry out actual inflation targeting. So it wasn't, the Fed having to kind of get the economy out of this unstable position the way that it had in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So that's sort of the story there, is that the aggregate demand curve had become upward sloping in the late 70s, early 80s. And so therefore it required this dramatic focus on bringing inflation down. But then the sort of story moving forward was, hey, we probably won't have to do that again if we keep the aggregate demand curve where it should be and focused in the direction it should be. And so that became a much larger focus of monetary policy. So in that way, Taylor and sort of what we might call post-monetarists, who really focused on inflation expectations, were so influential to this particular idea. And then lastly, as I mentioned, I just want to say kind of a brief moment about RBC, real business cycle models. To me, I always put real business cycle models kind of into the same camp as sort of the monetarist post-Keynesian sort of Taylor rule stuff, not necessarily because they're the same types of models, but because they came from a classical perspective as well. Real business cycle models are very much focused on kind of micro foundations and really kind of a focus on the what they felt was the utter randomness ultimately of economic dynamics. In particular, the idea behind real business cycle is that the economy is mostly induced to move due to fluctuations, not as Keynes argued, in aggregate demand, but fluctuations in aggregate supply. Now, this may on the surface seem quite classical. We sort of argued that in the classical sort of argument, aggregate supply is sort of what shifted to equilibrate the economy. However, classicals, I don't think, believed that aggregate supply shifted much. Now, that might be because the classicals lived in the 17 and 1800s. Right? The RBC folks are in the 70s and 80s and 90s when technological innovation explodes and you see increases in productivity that we never saw before. And really, I think what the RBC folks ultimately come to believe is that what ends up driving sort of this ultimate idea of economic growth, or really just even intermittent economic conditions, is that there is this sort of relative there's a sort of relative unstableness of aggregate supply, and in particular, a relative unstableness of aggregate supply in a world in which there's policy driven on the demand side that is inherently inflationary. Because as we know, the aggregate supply curve is very sensitive to inflation expectations. That's one of the messages of the dynamic model. Now, imagine a world where not only is supply highly sensitive to expectations, but that expectations have near instantaneous embedding into the actual aggregate supply. So the argument of real business cycle folks is that if we think about the economy here and the way that it sort of grows over time, what they're seeing is that in all of these spurts, sort of boom periods, bust periods, boom periods, bust periods, right? Because it's sort of the same story each time, right? In the boom periods, we eventually get inflation, and then the economy declines, we get deflation, right? Inflation, deflation, da, 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 da. And then every once in a while, though, we'll get these moments where maybe, like say, for example, the economy declines, but we get higher inflation. So why did that happen, right? What's the question? Why would you get higher inflation and the economy is not doing so well? We actually have a story for this. And the real business cycle folks were like, that's not a mystery. We actually know exactly why we get lower output and higher inflation. And it's because the supply curve shifted back. But again, in the Keynesian world, the thought was, especially over the long run, aggregate supply doesn't shift that often, and it's almost always just going to be shifting outward, right? And the only reason why the aggregate supply curve would shift back is because of big, huge things like oil price shocks, like we had in the 1970s. Real business cycle folks were like, no, 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 no. That the aggregate supply curve is much more sensitive to economic dynamics than what we've previously thought. And what I think is very interesting about this, and this is an argument that I would make, I think this ends up fairly fitting well into the Keynesian idea of animal spirits. And what's weird and why that is this. So RBC models are highly sort of focused on this idea of rational expectations, market clearing, but that sometimes there's this sort of economic dysfunction and exogenous shock. It's random, so therefore policy didn't see it coming. Therefore, you run the risk of not responding to it well enough, and so on and so forth. RBC folks, they end up having fairly laissez-faire views. They think these boom and bust cycles are sort of corrections. In particular, bust cycles are sort of inflationary corrections or just market dysfunction corrections. But I think what's interesting about it is that if you simply think that animal spirits, that is the sort of primitive nature of why we invest, the primitive nature of why we seek profits as humans, let's say that's true, that is why we seek profits. But you in your primitive nature of seeking profits, you can want to then be good at seeking profit. So what ends up happening, I think, in the sense of especially modern economic systems that are a little bit more turbulent and maybe inflation and economic growth are more stable, but sort of year over year, there tend to be these fairly significant fluctuations. Inflation goes up to 4%. That may mean that in a given year, real wages didn't change at all. So if you sort of take the basic sort of output didn't change much, inflation didn't change much, but maybe people's incomes didn't increase this year, that may have fairly large ramifications for next year's stock market or next year's bull market could then turn into a bear market. So things can still be driven by animal spirits, and animal spirits themselves can be driven by fairly rational expectations. And then the idea here is that because things are being driven by rational expectations, the near real-time updating of expectations as well as the contextual notion of what's going on in the economic system in turn causes there to be this near sort of constant fluctuation in aggregate supply. The sort of upshot of all this is that any sort of demand management, therefore, becomes very problematic. Because, for example, let's say that the economy has declined. That output has declined, so we've gone below potential output in this direction, right? What RBC folks say is that you may not know that this declined because of aggregate supply. The economy has just slowed down. And aggregate demand could be flat enough that you get so little inflation that you don't necessarily perceive there to be this dysfunction. So you don't sort of do anything to kind of buoy the aggregate supply side, and then you try to boost the economy through aggregate demand management, right? Expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy, and of course, what you've just done is just caused inflation because, in a sense, aggregate supply is now so sensitive to the real kind of values of the economic system. It sort of instantaneously bakes in all of this sort of dynamic that you don't necessarily know where the economy is, and therefore demand management becomes very, very difficult. And what's interesting is that if you go back to kind of the monetarist argument, the kind of Milton Friedman sort of world, ultimately we don't sort of agree with Milton Friedman about sort of targeting money supply growth, mainly because we think it's very hard to estimate money demand. And so our inability to estimate money demand causes us to have a hard time, therefore, estimating the right level of money growth. The RBC folks basically argue it's very hard for us to really at any given point understand what aggregate supply is doing. Therefore, it becomes very difficult for us to get aggregate demand management right. And so then ultimately the RBC folks kind of come back to these fairly classical ideas that, we should not necessarily see recessions or general economic contractions as economic dysfunction, but rather it could just be this natural exogenous shock to the economy. And really what we should just allow is people to respond to that shock in what we think are the efficient way possible. So, you get a very capitalism, competitive economic markets argument here. And so this sort of prescribes a fairly non-activist policy, mostly on the fiscal side. RBC folks, I think, tend to agree that Taylor rule type ideas are probably a pretty good idea on monetary policy. So basically, the sense here with RBC is that the aggregate demand, especially through fiscal policy management, is just too unwieldy. You can't rein it in. It's like a bunking bronco in a sense. And then you sort of on top of that put in the idea that aggregate supply is sort of constantly moving back and forth, but not necessarily in ways that you know or can understand. Then you can imagine why folks like that would tend to think that policy should sort of be very cautious. And so, again, we don't necessarily think that RBC tells the full story in 2025, but we certainly, I think, most economists have incorporated the idea that it is very hard to sort of know where you are, and therefore it becomes hard sometimes for the Federal Reserve, especially, to send the appropriate signal they want to send, because they are in a sense sort of trying to predict not only where the economy is going, but where the economy sort of is. And so one of the ways that they try to understand where the economy is they look, especially at things like, durable good purchases, those sort of supply side intermediate purchases. Really, what are the orders? How much steel orders are there in the economy? How much, natural gas is being moved about the economy? Those sort of big kind of ticket commodity items. Because those orders end up telling you a little bit more about kind of what's going on just in terms of transactions. And so that kind of, real time sort of the economy is constantly kind of moving up and down. You sort of couple that idea with a sort of, again, this sort of lean against the wind policy. And then general sort of a fairly Keynesian perspective on, well, when we do go into dysfunction, there's some sense that it's okay to alleviate the extent of that dip with some sort of demand management, but we have to be very careful because it's hard to get that right. Right. That's it. Right. That's sort of the Keynesian kind of post-Keynesian story. And so, yeah, I mean, now you go into an upper level, advanced macro class, and you're going to dig in a lot more to this Taylor rule stuff. You're going to dig into the RBC stuff, and you should be well prepared for that. Okay. So now we're going to stop ourselves there and move into solo growth. So see you then.